Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Germany could not win. World War II, Part 2. If you haven't seen the first part, check it out. I'm going to put an info card as well as it'll be in the description. I'll probably pin a comment as well. I got some interesting comments on the last one. One of the main ones from my friend Gavun. At least that's his name online. I won't say his real name in real life. He noted we brought up the bomb discussion because that was just a small brief thing that I brought about that Japan, they actually didn't need to have the bomb dropped on them because the Soviets would have invaded. They would have capitulated anyways. I think I'm going to save that one for another video, but still some interesting comments. Comment on this one. Let me know what you guys think. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Trying to get to 1,000 subscribers right now, so every single subscription helps. So without further ado, let's get into Germany could not win, definitely, no matter what, part 2. Ah, nice. So I never played the original Medal of Honor. Yeah, Allied Assault. I never played this one actually.
With the German miss, pal.
But I played what's the one? Airborne. Medal of Honor Airborne. That's a good one.
Here's to hoping
And then the remake sucked.
sources will be used in the future. However, our intel has picked up reports of continued resistance in the comment sections. Mentions of Dunkirk and who not to invade seem widespread.
Yep.
We will be dropping you directly into the comment section with your primary objective being to root out these myths. Be cautious though. Reports indicate that the Wehrabus will be armed with Cold War era memoirs.
Yep.
And David Irving
Which is
books.
just what we talked about last time.
Godspeed, Lieutenant.
Yep. For those who don't know, the historian he mentioned, David, I don't remember his last name off the top of my head. He just mentioned it though, sorry. He was actually a very prominent historian at the time. And he actually wrote a few books on Hitler and uncovered some evidence that had never been uncovered before. But then it turns out that he was actually a giant Nazi sympathizer. And so these days, he's pretty much a discredited historian, and he sort of does the neo-Nazi circuit in Europe and the USA and stuff like this. He's been pretty thoroughly discredited at this point. However, a lot of his evidence is still used in some debates that are not, that don't know that a lot of what he claimed to have found was actually debunked. Okay, that's a big long piece of text, but I'm not going to read it, but maybe pause it.
Stay secure online and never forget a password again. More on that later. So you may recall around 6 months ago, I made a video about how due to Germany's lacking in the population, industrial, and raw materials sectors, they could not have pulled out a victory in the war they started in 1939. And it sorta got out of hand.
I think we should read the comments.
It's pretty funny.
The other day, as I was reading the comment section there, I found that, along with some people agreeing with me, there were a lot of dissenting opinions of yet more ways that people thought the final victory could be achieved. And I am here today to respond to them. And also probably clear up what I meant at the end of the last video, talking about limited use of alternative history. Here are a few more ways Germany could not have won World War II.
Ah, yes.
One thing I have seen brought up a few times is that if Hitler had not let the British Expeditionary Force get away at Dunkirk, that later the troops could not be used during Operation Overlord and thus no Western Front, with the implication that the German troops could have been sent east to stop the Soviets. This, however, has two problems. Firstly, the BEF was not simply allowed to leave France as this narrative suggests.
Yes, and this is a very common myth that is thought that there was mercy, that there was anything. I've talked about this before actually quite a few times. So I'm really glad he's bringing this up. I don't want to say anything to you yet because I'll probably just bring it up in a moment, but really happy he's bringing this one up.
In Mein Kampf, Hitler does speak highly of the British at times and suggests that they could be a potential ally, but this is clearly without a strong grasp of British culture and political policy, and was always discussed with Germany being above Britain and having them be administrators of the Reich, but only if they could shake their, quote, Jewish influence. Furthermore, he realized that Britain was against his intentions in the East and would become a barrier there. All this being said, by the time of the invasion of France, Britain was definitely an enemy, and Hitler was doing them no favors. So then why Dunkirk? Well, this was an operational failing, not a peaceful gesture.
Yes.
On May 15th, 1940, the Germans broke through the French 2nd and 9th armies and steamed ahead night and day, thanks in part to some tablet boys, towards the coast. Although these gains were good for...
That's another thing about the tablet boys. This is sort of where I'm lacking information, so I don't want to comment on it, but how prevalent was the use of narcotics and amphetamines in the German war effort? I've heard that used a lot, Nazis on drugs and all this, but how true is that really? I don't know. Maybe one of you guys could help fill me in on the comment section below, but who knows? Maybe that's another video.
The Germans, the mechanized forces were quickly running out of supplies and were leaving their flanks exposed, which opened them to being cut off, the result of which could cause ruin for the German plans. It is at this point a nervous Hitler, being counseled by Generals von Kluge and von Rundstedt, gave a halt order to secure the flanks and allow the exhausted panzer divisions to refit. Check out this video by Mark Gurges for more. Upon the halt, our favorite drug-addled flyboy Goering promised the Luftwaffe could destroy the British at Dunkirk, and although he failed, I would hardly call the actions of the Luftwaffe just letting the British go. With thousands being killed, over 200 ships being sunk, over 100 planes shot down, and the loss of all the BEF's equipment, Hitler even realized that the halt was an error and resumed the attack while the evacuation was underway, and it was only successful due to the brave French soldiers that held out until it was complete. But even if he...
So that's... I hope that's not a real photo. So that's one thing that was actually also mentioned in one of the comments on the last videos, was that the French fought incredibly bravely at Dunkirk, and this is not something that was actually shown in the film Dunkirk by Christopher Nolan. But I think a lot of people forget about the French actions that they held ferociously against overwhelming odds from the Germans. And a lot of gratitude can be put towards those French soldiers that fought and died trying to secure the eventual evacuation of those troops.
Had let them go. There are still more problems asserting that this means a German victory in the war. Britain had to rearm all the soldiers evacuated, which is a huge loss and took some time. This force, when returned to England, was not in any way ready to turn around and invade France, although the troop reserves were good to have if Germany decided to invade. But they were not in fighting condition for a long time. But most importantly, Britain is not the only nation present at D-Day. A combined landing force of American, British, and Canadian forces, along with smaller groups from other countries, landed and fought on the Western Front. Although the troop loss, if Dunkirk had failed, may have limited Britain's number of troops, the United States, having only mobilized about 9% of its population in the course of the war, could have very realistically filled in the gaps as it did in reality with the British equipment losses. But all of this still doesn't take into account where the real war is being fought, in the East. The German army will be decidedly on its back foot after Kursk, and the Soviets have massive offensives planned in 1944 regardless of what the Western Allies do. Would the defeat of Germany have taken longer without the Western Front opening? Of course it would. But by 1944, the Soviets have a decisive upper hand and will push the Germans back to Berlin. So to say the war could have been shifted if the British had 300,000 fewer troops ignores the reality of what the Germans were truly up against by 1944.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing, though, that is interesting is that while I do overall agree with him, and I don't think that the outcome of these 300,000 troops being killed or captured or something is Germany winning the war, however, it's an interesting idea to see could it have maybe postponed the eventual end date of June 1945. That's sort of an interesting, May 1945, not June. It's sort of an interesting idea, though, actually, of could it have maybe not have won them the war, rather would it have postponed, the eventual victory in Europe. Interesting idea, but as he says, I mean, the United States are coming in anyways, and all the allies. It's not just Britain, so. Do not declare war on insert superpower. Well, that requires the Nazis not being Nazis, and that's not going to happen. So
this is another one I saw a lot. Just don't invade the Soviet Union, or just don't
never would have happened.
Declare war on the United States. And although these comments are puzzling on the surface, as removing a major combatant redefines what the war is, and you are now describing how to win a smaller conflict,
true,
there are reasons that
then it's basically a HoI4 mod.
Doesn't work that are all to do with character motivation and why these things were going to happen unless you fundamentally change who the Germans and Hitler were, and then stray into fiction. Let's first start with the Soviet Union. If you read Mein Kampf, don't do it, it's not a very good book, or listen to a lot of Hitler's speeches, both in public and in private, he fixates on this idea of Judeo-Bolshevism, which is a rather outdated term that grew out of the idea of a Jewish conspiracy that had created communism, and the two were the biggest evils facing the Aryan nation. There's a whole rabbit hole to go down here with multiple theorists and their ideas, but I'm not going to go into it here. But that's the basic idea, and Hitler subscribed to it. And the result of this is Hitler's main goal being to destroy the Soviet Union and become the savior of the Aryan people in his eyes, and in the process, wiping out millions of subhuman Slavs and resettle the land with Germans. Hitler saw this as his destiny, meaning he was going to do it at some point, and that this fictitious Hitler that would win World War II by not invading the East is just that, fiction. He ceases becoming the Hitler that we know and that existed, and now we're talking about a made-up story. Now, as to why the Soviet Union was invaded when it was, comes down to two things: resources and, frankly, paranoia. Germany, as I outlined in my previous video on this, spent a...
I think, though, the one important thing to mention is the why. And he did just focus on that, but I think the real emphasis here is that it was ideological. It was impossible for Bolshevism and Nazism to be separated in any manner that didn't end in them fighting, right? In fighting in a grand scale war. And ideology really is the driving force here. I'm a little bit torn on the two reasons being resources and paranoia. However, let's see what he says.
A lot of the war with fairly limited oil resources, and knew that it couldn't support this attack any later than June of 41 with all the fuel that the battle over Britain was consuming. And even the trade with the Soviet Union would not make up for this deficit. So the High Command felt they had to go in when they did before the army would not be able to move as they needed to finish the campaign by September, the time in which the High Command figured the Soviet Union would collapse in on itself under the weight of the German attack. And I'll point you to David Stayhill again for more information on that. The other aspect was, as I said, paranoia. I've often seen this assertion stated in a different way of don't break the alliance with the Soviet Union, although I wouldn't even frame the German-Soviet non-aggression pact as an alliance in the way you think of with the Axis and Allies. The treaty was much more in the vein of you don't get in our way, we won't get in your way, let's trade some stuff.
Absolutely.
And it was very uneasy at many points before and during its existence, becoming most volatile during combat between German and Soviet soldiers during the Poland campaign, after the Germans overran the territory that was designated as theirs and moved into territory promised to the Soviets that actually contained oil fields, making it not very subtle what the Germans were trying to do. Both Stalin and Hitler knew that some form of war was coming, just not when and who would start it, but going out of their way for the most part to not provoke it. And they didn't trust each other whatsoever. Now, I'm not implying any kind of Suvorov preventative war type thing. The Soviet Union was refitting and probably wouldn't be ready for a large war until at least mid-1942, but with these two ideologically opposing powers taking territory so quickly right next to each other, it was something that was bound to happen as soon as one of them felt they were in a position to make the first move. By 1941, the Germans felt they were, and they took the opportunity. For more on this,
so an interesting
and the German-Soviet clashes in Poland, I'll point you towards Stephen Kotkin's second book in his Stalin series, or this video of him talking about it. The declaration of war on the U.S. is a bit more tricky.
So before they hop into the U.S., I think that there's some interesting theories that are thrown around. I'm not sure how. I can't verify them right now, and not that I have the resources to verify them. However, there are some interesting theories of whether the Soviets had planned on invading Germany anyways in 1942. But I think that, it was more or less a sort of a agreement of mutual understanding rather than an alliance, right? For example, between the UK, France, and the USA and Canada and all these other countries. This would have come crashing down anyways. But an interesting idea that I think was debated between some of the high command and Hitler was exactly when to invade the Soviet Union. And I believe that the invasion of Greece had actually pushed them back. I believe it was 2 weeks because they had to bring those reserve troops that had to finish off the Greeks, which the Italians had failed at because the Greeks fought ferociously against the Italians and actually pushed them into Albania. So they had to really re-divert those troops to Greece that could have been put on the Eastern Front. So, I think that was there was a bit of disagreement on that, and it's interesting to think of what might have happened if they had those extra 2 weeks, but I don't think it changes the outcome anyways.
Especially given that Hitler was aware of the industrial capacity of the nation. However, he saw the US as very internally focused and figured that it would take them much longer to mobilize than it did. Hitler always planned for war with the United States, as outlined in his second book, written but not published.
Again, using those books are not always the best sources, especially the second book, which is sort of all over the place and is sort of unpublished. And in Mein Kampf, he obviously emphasized, he really exaggerated a lot of truths. But overall, I think his sort of planning can be, trace back to some of these books as well.
Published in 1928, but wanted to put it off until he was ready, often skipping on details about how it would be done. He began to assume that, due to some anti-German sentiments from Roosevelt, the Americans would declare war in 1942, coming to the aid of the Allies like they did in World War I. Piggybacking off the previous statements about the Soviets, he figured he could end the war in the East and turn and fight the West. This feeling ended, though, as the Soviet campaign continued to drag on and 1942 loomed. The German Navy had been asking for war with the United States for some time, as Hitler
I was literally just about to bring that
had
up.
been holding them back to not provoke them, knowing that going against the US Navy, the Kriegsmarine would come up lacking. Hitler's solution to this was Japan, which had a large navy that he thought could tie up the Americans until he was done in Russia, then turn westward and save his plan. He constantly reassured the Japanese that Germany would throw in with them if they expanded their territory south into US-held islands. This was among many attempts to get Germany and Japan to fight the same enemy, which also included trying to get Japan to invade the Soviet Union from the east.
And we talked
in
about
June.
that
Although
in
Japan
the last
kept
video.
Hitler in the dark as to when they were going to attack, Hitler was very pleased when they did and immediately lifted all restrictions on his navy to attack US ships, and later declared war a few days later after his foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, said, "A great power does not allow itself to be declared war upon, it declares war on others." Now, this decision may have been flawed with the hindsight of putting too much faith in the Japanese Navy and underestimating the US's ability to fight on two fronts and mobilize so quickly, but knowing that Hitler did plan to fight the US way back in the 20s, the timing may be bad given what we know now, but it was not something that he was just not going to do, in the same way he was not going to just opt out of invading the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and the other thing too, with the Kriegsmarine just basically begging at some point to declare war on the United States, you got to remember a lot of supply ships, right, were moving into Britain, were moving into different parts of the world, and these, in theory, could not have been sunk, right? They could not have been sunk by the Kriegsmarine, and so the sort of unrestricted submarine warfare that we saw in World War I, the Kriegsmarine really wanted for World War II. So that's one of the main reasons to declare war. And I think, too, the United States probably would have gotten into the war inevitably. Just because Germany did it first doesn't mean that the United States would have just been, oh, okay, well, let's stay entirely neutral in this and don't, invade Germany. It was probably inevitable as it is. I mean, the one thing to mention, too, is that the Japanese were incredibly effective in those first steps. Of really seizing Southeast Asia and its materials, but then after Midway, right, the major battle, the major Atlantic battle, in the Pacific and Midway, the Japanese only ever were on the back pedal from there on. So the Japanese were initially successful. They knew they couldn't have waged a war against the United States long term, and so they thought that the best idea was to do a lightning quick strike, being Pearl Harbor, and then, while they have the time, seize the southern resources and then continue on from there. Yeah, right.
This is the one that I see the most. Take the British out before you turn east. As if it was that
Nope.
simple. The Germans tried this. First by attempting to bomb the British into submission, which didn't work. And second by
And we have to actually account too that not only did it not just work, but it was relatively close. Right? The Battle of Britain, with a lot of the volunteer pilots, like including the Polish that had just seen their country taken over by both the Soviet Union and the Germans, really did change a large outcome for the war here. Right? It pushed the plans away from fighting Great Britain and really was a great Allied victory, though it was close. Right? If the Germans had have destroyed the entire RAF, right, or very close to it, right, you got to think about the delays, right? So I'm more in favor of not saying, here's how Germany could have won, but rather here's what could have delayed, right, the eventual victory in Europe. And so there's some fascinating ideas there with what if they had have destroyed it, but I don't think that an invasion really would have been a conclusion there if they had have destroyed the RAF.
planning the invasion of the British home island in an operation named Sea Lion. This was going to be the amphibious
Every
assault that
HoI4
would take
player will
Britain
know
out
that.
of the war, and plans were drawn up and early preparations were made. But before going through with it, the Germans themselves realized this wasn't going to work and canceled it. The short answer for why is the Royal Navy and the inability of the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe to control the channel. The German Navy would be unable to keep the channel clear of British warships to enable troops and supplies to reach the British coast unless the army's landing was on a very narrow front, resulting in less water needing to be covered. Knowing the coast was going to be heavily defended, the army rejected this plan as they would need a wide landing front so they were not just feeding feeding men into a meat grinder. In short, the Germans did not have the material to carry out a successful landing without it either bogging down and being cut off on the ground, or being simply sunk on the way to its destination. In the 70s, the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst wargamed the scenario with conditions favorable to the Germans, and came up with the operation being a total failure. Some commenters have gone as far as to suggest using paratroopers to take the British down, but I think you need to only look as far as Crete and Arnhem to see how badly an unsupported airborne operation can go. The Germans would still have to land by sea to resupply them and get relief troops on...
Correct me if I'm wrong, but Crete was a success, no? Maybe someone can help me out there on the comments.
...on the ground. And the Royal Navy was too large an obstacle to allow this to happen, even by the Germans' own admission.
Yeah, see, exactly. And so to think that, I mean, D-Day was carried out with naval supremacy and air supremacy, right? And I've talked about this before, but to think that this could have been done with not only the Royal Navy, and even if we discount and say the RAF has been destroyed, so the Luftwaffe has air supremacy, right? To get that naval superiority over the British, and then to launch a ginormous invasion on the British home front, which, as we know, urban areas, they soak up troops. The losses would have been, one, catastrophic, but two, to be able to support that through supplies only navally and maybe airborne. I don't see any realistic scenario in which Germany ever could have taken the British Isles.
One particular comment out of all of them really stood out to me. It began with, if the Nazis weren't Nazis, they would have won. And I think this really speaks to the core of my point.
Well, because of yeah, if the Nazi, yeah, exactly.
Alternative history is fun. It makes for good HoI4 games. But when really talking about it seriously, it's really hard to come by any academic conclusions outside of a few days of speculation. Because you begin building assumption on assumption on assumption, and before you know it, you have changed the motivations and decision-making patterns of everybody you're talking about. And you are then just writing fan fiction.
This is your brain. This is your brain on alternative history.
Would Germany have won World War II if the Nazis weren't in power? Maybe. But it's also equally likely they wouldn't have started the war, or joined the Allies, or anything else. If there's no basis in reality to do with the people you are talking about in your assumption, what's the point? Germany decided to start a war that within a little over 2 years would see them taking on 3 superpowers at once, with the resources of most of the world behind them. Add in strategic mistakes and intelligence failures, it paints a very grim picture from the start, regardless of decisions made after the fact. Speaking of intelligence failures, don't let your private information go the way of the German armies. There are plenty of Alan Turing...
Okay, let's see. Is this all just an ad?
To have that extra level of security that Dashlane provides. Dashlane can be your...
Looks like it. Okay. Well, there you go. There's the code for potential history that's probably expired by now. Anyways, so yeah, that's pretty much that. Even with these couple of other things, I'm sure there's some other popular theories, but I think that potential history here covered a lot of them. I totally agree with pretty much everything that he says. So yeah, sorry, this one isn't really me disagreeing and debating this one. But yeah, nonetheless, I think these are fun videos. Thank you all very much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Join the Discord if you have any reaction video suggestions, or put them in the YouTube comments, but it's always better to put them in the Discord because that's how I organize them, and I have a little check system, etc., etc. And yeah, without that, take care. See you guys in the next one. Ciao, ciao.